the biggest reforms in Indian military history. A total overhaul to make Indian forces future combat ready. Armed forces to be reorganized into multiple theatre commands. But are all forces on board? The most complex military reorganization currently underway in India. To be battle ready for two hostile neighbors on land, sea, air, space and cyberspace. That's our top focus on Battle Cry. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Battle Cry. I'm Gaurav Sawant. The biggest defense reforms in the history of independent India. Operational theatre commands. Now this has been in the works for decades. Finally, the country by the end of this year or early 2022 may just see a lean and mean war machine both on the western and the eastern borders. This is for better synergy, right from planning to operations to op logistics. On Battle Cry, Indian Armed Forces getting future combat ready is our top story.
India and China's tanks stood less than 100 meters apart on the south bank of Pangong Tso in Ladakh. The newly inducted Rafales flew combat sorties, scanning the enemy's air and land assets. And Navy ships and submarines sailed out to send out a signal that India was prepared to protect its national interests. But in the corridors of power, there was a realization that the Indian Armed Forces needed to speed up setting up unified theatre commands. This is the biggest reform in Indian military history post-independence. A total overhaul to make the three armed forces future combat ready and cohesive. The Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, told India today that theaterization was now in an advanced stage and will look to optimize the resources of all three forces instead of functioning separately under their own commands.
जो युद्ध की प्रक्रिया है उसको आगे बढ़ाने के लिए ये जरूरी है कि तीनों सेनाओं में जॉइंटनेस लाई जाए, हम एकत्रित होके हमारी जो शक्तियां हैं उनको कायम रखें और किस तरह से इस कार्रवाई को आगे बढ़ाएं। इसके लिए अनिवार्य है कि हम लोग थिएटर कमांड बना के आगे की कार्रवाई करते रहें। इस प्रक्रिया में काफ़ी तेज़ी से कार्रवाई चल रही है। तीनों सेनाओं में सहमति हो गई है कि हमें इसी दिशा में आगे बढ़ना है।
As on date, the armed forces have 17 commands. The Army has 7, the Indian Air Force has 7, and the Navy has 3. But this leads to a multiplicity of authority, overlap, duplication of resources, and lack of jointness in both policy, plans, and operations. The aim is to set up theatre commands headed by a 3-star general with all resources of the Army, Navy, and Air Force under a single command. In the Kargil War of 1999, shortcomings were noticed in planning and joint operations. The Kargil Review Committee had recommended setting up of integrated commands and a Chief of Defence Staff. In January 2020, General Bipin Rawat was appointed India's first CDS, and a Department of Military Affairs was carved out to promote jointness in operations. For more coordinated planning and operations, the Chief of Defence Staff has been tasked with integrating the three armed forces for setting up geographical and theatre-specific theatre commands.
जम्मू कश्मीर में आप जानते हैं अभी तक बॉर्डर पूरी तरह डिमार्केट नहीं हुआ है, जिसे हम लाइन ऑफ कंट्रोल कहते हैं, और चीन के साथ हमारा लाइन ऑफ एक्चुअल कंट्रोल है, जहाँ पे भी हमारी सीमाओं पर अभी विवाद चल रहा है। तो इसलिए ज़रूरी है कि इन सीमाओं को ध्यान में रखते हुए, अपने देश की सुरक्षा को ध्यान में रखते हुए हम एकजुट होकर लैंड बेस्ड कमांड्स बनाएं, एक पश्चिमी छोर के लिए और एक पूर्वी छोर के लिए। तो इस तरह से हमारी कार्रवाई चल रही है कि हमारी लैंड बेस्ड कमांड्स होंगी, हमारी एयर डिफेंस कमांड होगी और हमारी मैरीटाइम कमांड बनेगी।
The armed forces are currently working towards establishing an air defense command, an integrated Eastern Theatre Command, a Western Theatre Command, and a maritime security command.
दुनिया की जितनी भी सेनाएं हैं, जो बड़ी सेनाएं हैं, उन्होंने सब ने इंटीग्रेशन कर लिया है। चाहे वो आप देखिए अमेरिका को देखिए, आप फ्रांस को देखिए, आप यूके को देखिए, आप हमारे प्रतिद्वंदी चीन को देखिए, इन सब ने इंटीग्रेट करके कार्रवाई कर रहे हैं। और ये इंटीग्रेशन इसलिए किया जा रहा है कि तीनों सशस्त्र सेनाओं का जब एकजुट मिलकर जब ये कार्रवाई करेंगे तो उससे हमें ज़्यादा शक्ति प्रदान होगी। हम ज़्यादा सही तरीके से अपने जो रिसोर्सेज हैं, चाहे वो मैन पावर रिसोर्सेज हों, इक्विपमेंट रिसोर्सेज हों या वेपन्स हों, उनको सही तरीके से इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं।
The country already has the Andaman and Nicobar Command established in 2001, and the Strategic Forces Command has been operational since 2003. There are also the Defence Cyber Agency, Space Agency, and the Special Forces Division already operational. The CDS has made a presentation to the Defence Minister earlier this month as well. Several armed forces across the world have carried out similar reforms in military affairs to different degrees of integration. The United States, Russia, and China are among the countries that have established theatre commands. Tibet's border with India, for example, is part of China's Western Theatre Command. The aim is to launch 4 theatre commands by the end of the year in India, but the nuts and bolts are still work in progress and being strongly resisted by some stakeholders. Bureau Report, India Today.
There are teething troubles with the formation of theatre commands. Many see this as turf wars, but is this more than just a war for control of assets? The Indian Air Force, many argue, is still not completely on board the theatre command concept. The Indian Air Force says its assets are limited and can be deployed across theatres, across the country, and should not be compartmentalized. The Indian Air Force has repeatedly told the Chief of Defence Staff and the government that they want to pursue the one nation, one theatre concept. The battle lines are clearly drawn.
The establishment of Eastern and Western Theatre Commands is witnessing heavy turbulence after hitting an air pocket in India. The Indian Air Force has red flagged the existing system of theatre commands, objecting to the commands being more Army and Navy centric, where the Indian Air Force would be reduced to being an adjunct force instead of the main war-winning factor. The Indian Air Force has repeatedly cited an acute shortage of fighter aircraft and assets, insisting that further splitting existing assets into different theatres would adversely impact Air Force war-winning capabilities. The Indian Air Force has a sanctioned strength of 42.5 squadrons, but currently is down to a little over 31. Splitting the strength into Western, Eastern and Maritime commands would reduce the Indian Air Force's ability, it says, to operate and play a decisive role in changing the course of combat. The Indian Air Force sees itself as a game changer in future combat, with fighter jets, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, swarm drones and long and medium range missiles in a defense shield. The Indian Air Force is pushing the idea of one nation, one theatre to optimize the use of air power.
With just 30 squadrons and 3 AWACS, out of which we can expect at any given time only 2 serviceable, and 2 airborne early warning and control aircraft, how do you divide such assets when we are scraping the bottom of the barrel into theatres?
The Air Force has also sought more clarity from the government on whether the Eastern and Western Maritime Command leadership is rotational like the Andaman and Nicobar Command, or will it be restricted to the single dominating land or maritime force? The Army, on the other hand, maintains that there is a realization of the decisive role played by the Indian Air Force in future combat, and no longer can forces operate in their own silos. The Army also points out that the Air Force's reluctance to join operations in the initial phase of Kargil before taking the government's clearance led to a delay in responses to Pakistan's intrusions, and more Army lives were lost.
The major reservation, it seems, it is from the Air Force, because they have a different system of centralized coordination based on their assets profile. So therefore, there has been some recommendations also that there can be rotational commands between the three services.
Implementing something as momentous as reorganizing the entire armed forces into theatre commands from the traditional Army, Air Force and Naval commands is going to be a very challenging task. And I don't think it should be something that should be taken up in a hurry or pushed through just because there's an agenda somebody has of wanting to introduce it. Theatre commands involve not only repositioning, it's not about having senior officers or how many CNCs, etc. It's about repositioning your entire deployment capability to be able to address the requirements of the theatre command.
The Chief of Defence Staff has the task of not only getting the three armed forces on board, but has also set up a high-powered committee of the Vice Chiefs to iron out differences and set up integrated theatre commands. The committee will also engage. Whether the current hurdles can be crossed remains to be seen. What is certain is that this will be the most ambitious military reforms since independence, and there can be no longer any delay. Bureau Report, India Today.
So 4 theatre commands by Independence Day, or at least by the end of the year, is the promise of the Chief of Defence Staff. But is the Indian Air Force completely on board? And if not, does this mean that once again things need to be taken back to the drawing board? Joining me on Battle Cry, Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia, former Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Western Air Command, a veteran of the Kargil War, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, former Director General of Infantry, the man who planted the first tricolour on the Siachen Glacier's northernmost tip, and of course India Today's Executive Editor Sandeep Unnithan. Air Marshal Ahluwalia, if I may, is the Indian Air Force putting a spanner in the works when it comes to creation of theatre commands?
Well, Gaurav, the question is, what do we imply by spanner in the works? The question is, as far as the Air Force is concerned, we definitely believe in joint warfare. We believe in synergy. We believe in equal partnership to prosecute a war in the national interest at all levels. However, there are certain constraints, and we have to understand the value of air power and how we are going to make the most of it. Because please remember that air power is most important and crucial for prosecution of any kind of conflict or war in the future. It will make all the difference. Like it was said, that you cannot win wars by air power alone, but you can't lose any war, you can't win any war without air power. The question is, why do we want a theatre command? Yes, synergy. But when you're talking about synergy, as far as the Air Force is concerned, we are talking about joint planning, joint doctrines, CONOPS, strategy. That is what we think is most important, rather than having people under command. Now,
fair enough. So the Indian Air Force says joint planning, joint operations, but each force controls its assets. General Kulkarni, Indian Air Force also says they're down to perhaps 30 to 31 fighter squadrons. If these assets are split further, then combat effectiveness may just be adversely impacted. So theatre commands do not work in the current scenario for the Indian Air Force.
Gaurav, first and foremost, I agree with Air Marshal Ahluwalia. Air Force firmly believes in synergy and jointness. We have no doubts on that score. And we have great we take pride in the Indian Air Force. Having said that, what happens is, what exactly is theaterization all about? It is nothing but optimally utilizing the integrated capabilities of the three services. We understand that it cannot be mathematical distribution. We understand that the Air Force is no longer to be used in close air support or to be used as an air artillery. We understand the aircrafts have got multiple role fighters that they have. We know very much that the war just might start with the Air Force and end with the Air Force absolutely neutralizing the enemy. It's very much clear. Absolutely. But what happens is, having seen now, for instance, just see the two adversaries that we have. Now, let's take the case of China. How many commands would be participating? Almost 6 active commands, 3 of the Army and 3 of the Air Force participating. What would be so from the Chinese side, they had 2 military regions now combined into one, the Western Theatre Commander, having entirely the responsibility to take on India. Other countries are, let's not talk about them. Only India is concerned. Now, here we have the problem would be of integration. I understand it all starts off with jointness in training, jointness in logistics, jointness in communication, jointness in vision, strategy, everything. But we must all be able to understand that until and unless the limited resources that we have to be used optimally. Then therefore, the Air Force concern is also legitimate that there are not 42 squadrons that they are supposedly supposed to have, and they are down to 30 or 35, but they are, of course, being equipped with Rafales, and futuristic they would have 5th generation aircraft. But
let me quickly bring in Sandeep Puneethan, and let's take this conversation further. Sandeep, what are options for the Chief of Defence Staff at this stage? The government is backing the armed forces when it comes to theatre commands, but even within the armed forces, that synergy, that jointmanship, at least on theatre commands, appears to be lacking at this stage.
Gaurav, the government is absolutely clear in its mind what it wants to do with theatre commands, irrespective of whatever disagreements we might have been seeing of late. The plan is as follows, that the 15th of August 2021, the theatre commands will commence formation. By the 15th of August 2022, the first commands will be operationalized. And by the 15th of August 2023, the process will be completed. So everything else, Gaurav, is just a lot of sound and fury. The fact is that the government is absolutely clear in its mind that it wants theatre commands, and that's the reason that the Chief of Defence Staff was appointed. And Gaurav, we've had 20 years to discuss and debate all these issues that we are talking about right now. So, I mean, once all this has been, set into motion, it doesn't really matter anymore. And it's just a matter of, implementing what you've already decided.
So now is the opportunity to take that command decision. And once that command decision has been taken, everyone has to fall in line in the armed forces. Air Marshal Ahluwalia, can the Indian Air Force, in your view, continue to operate in a silo, as some complain? In your appreciation, and since you fought in the Kargil War, what are lessons from the Kargil War?
I think, let's not talk about a silo, because the Air Force believes in jointmanship. I repeat again, Air Force believes in synergy for war fighting. However, the Air Force cannot be an adjunct to the Navy or to the Army. And we must understand professionally and not get on to announcements and pronouncements. As far as August is concerned, we all know it is Independence Day and we've got to make big announcements. But let's be practical also, because war fighting is a very serious matter.
Oh, absolutely.
I must tell you that basically, there's no time, so I can't go into details, but I'll just tell you a simple thing. The simple thing is that the Air Force believes and prosecutes war under centralized leadership, but operations are decentralized. In other words, the war planning is done at the headquarters level, command headquarters, shall we say, and the prosecution is done exactly at the squadron level. Now, that is the kind of interaction that we can have in the chain of command as far as the Air Force is concerned. You want to superimpose a couple of layers in between without any meaning whatsoever. It is not going to help your warfighting effort. You can imagine what happened in Kargil. And as you know, Gaurav, I was very much present and actively involved. And believe you me, we were getting all kinds of demands from the surface forces that, please help, offensive action,
Okay.
support, etc., etc., etc. But the decision had to be very professional, and the professional decision was go for places like Montezalo, go for logistics camps, and choke them. And that's exactly what worked.
Jen Kulkarni, is this then all about who controls the assets, who gives that instruction? The Air Force perhaps says their instructions will come from the Chief of Air Staff and not, if it's an operational command, if there's an Army General or a Navy Admiral, not through them, is, if I understand this correctly.
Gaurav, I don't think we should see it as Army, Air Force or Navy. That it should not be seen. It's a total integrated, warfare, future warfare, which will be fought as totally centralized, but under one leader, one commander. Until and unless we have that. Now, what we were talking about Kargil also, imagine, there are three services. Each of them do sort of meet together, get together, and are able to execute the task at hand at that point of time. But this kind of a thing only for war is not actually required. This kind of a theatre command, when they come up, the jointness has to be from day one till the execution if there is a war. And therefore, it's very essential for seamless command structures, for synchronized operations, all of them to be together. Nobody should think division of assets. Nobody should feel dilution of power. Nobody should think leadership and nomenclature. What is the geographical command? No, nothing like that.
The Air Marshal wants to respond to you. Okay, Air Marshal, go ahead. Please respond, sir.
I just want to, make all these corrections here, that the assets are very, very crucial. Today, we have 1.63 or 1.65% of your GDP being spent on defense. The most expensive service is the Air Force because of technology.
Yes.
Air Force assets, you might talk about 30 squadron, we are nowhere near that as far as efficiency is concerned. Maybe somewhere near 20 or so. I can use my aircraft, fly them for a mission from Srinagar, land at Adhampur, fly another mission, and then land at Jodhpur to another mission, go to Trivandrum to another mission, all within 24 hours. The basic principles of air power must be protected and must be respected. And that is mobility, flexibility, and transferring of assets from one theatre to another. And that is exactly what happened during Kargil and all the other.
But in Kargil, there were complaints, that the Air Force joined the party late, if I may. The Air Force launched its own Operation Safed Sagar and not Op Vijay.
I'll tell you the whole story, Gaurav. On the 7th, 8th of May, 99, finally, I'm underlining the word finally, the Army accepted that infiltrators had come into our actual line of control, the line that we were controlling. And it was then that the Army said, okay, the Air Force must get in. They went to the political leadership. The political leadership was also told at that time by the military leadership that don't involve the third dimensions at the moment. Okay. So therefore, the political decision did not come till the 26th of May, 99, wherein the Air Force was asked to then join in. On the 25th, rather, 0600, the aircraft were on target.
Sandeep, at this stage, is this then about turf wars? And we've read about turf wars even in the United States or when theatre commands were coming up in other countries. Now, does this then require a legal cover, a top-down approach, or once the Prime Minister has decided, everyone will and must fall in line?
Absolutely, Gaurav, this is an executive decision, and the government of the day has, in its wisdom, decided to appoint the Chief of Defence Staff and the theatre commanders, set up the theatre commands. And I've been talking to people who've been involved in this process, and what they tell me is that there have been scenarios, tabletop scenarios, which have been worked out over the last couple of months, where they would see the joint application of a military force and with all the three services in play. And they've kind of rehearsed these theatre commands in tabletop exercises. I know for a fact that there were 7 exercises that were carried out this year, where the Army, Navy, and the Air Force worked together, and the learnings were astonishing. And the fact is that it's a journey of 1,000 steps, Gaurav, and you have to take the first few steps. And you can always debate and argue that, it's air power or land power or naval power. But it's
You can keep improving. Air Marshal Ahluwalia, I have the last 30 seconds on the broadcast, and if I may, as General Kulkarni was pointing out, China has one theatre command for the entire border with India. We have multiple. Does that adversely impact India's response, sir?
Gaurav, that is bigger than the whole of India. The Western command of the Chinese geographically is bigger than the whole of India. Now you want to segregate into bits and pieces all your resources instead of holding on your resources and using them at your time and place of choosing. Number two, I think Sandeep, I don't agree with him. No war games worth the salt have been conducted as of today. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Sandeep. That is the main thing. Next thing I want to point out for Sandeep's benefit is that we do not, the political leadership does not take decisions off the cuff. They consider all the aspects.
That's the point. Is this off the cuff, or has this been in the pipeline or in the works for 2 decades? Sandeep, last 30 seconds. I'm already out of time. Sandeep, please respond.
Gaurav, like I said earlier, it's been in the pipeline for 2 decades. We've had 2 decades to go over all these arguments, and today, when it's already been announced almost 2 years ago, it's just a matter of implementation, Gaurav,
okay.
And we are already there. We've begun the process in about 4 years.
More serious than that.
Okay, I've run out of time on this show, but this is a story we'll be tracking very closely. The biggest reforms in India's military history and what it takes to bring them along. But as always, Air Marshal Ahluwalia, General Kulkarni, and Sandeep Unnithan, many thanks for joining me. Well, that is all we have time for on Battle Cry this week. Many thanks for watching. News and updates continue on India Today. Stay with us.